Welcome to Echo of Crime YouTube channel. Aurora, Missouri was a quiet place in the mid-1980s. Small houses, quiet evenings, familiar faces seen every day in grocery store aisles and at church gatherings. It was the kind of community where everyone believed they understood their neighbors. And so, when tragedy struck, it shook the town at its foundation. On the morning of April 23, 1986, smoke rose slowly from a small one-story home on the edge of town. Fire trucks arrived, neighbors gathered, and whispers filled the air before the flames were even out. Inside that home, firefighters found 79-year-old Polly Martz. The scene did not look like an accident. The discovery pointed to something more deliberate, something darker. The community braced for answers, expecting the truth to come quickly. But the truth did not come quickly. It came strangely, through a confession that appeared at first to solve everything, but instead opened questions that would take nearly a decade to unravel. Investigators began interviewing people in the area. They spoke with neighbors, acquaintances, and people who had seen Pauline in the days before the fire. There were rumors, small-town talk, guesses, suspicions passed from porch to porch. The police were under pressure to bring closure. They needed a suspect. In the days following the incident, attention turned to 20-year-old Johnny Lee Wilson, a young man living nearby. Johnny was known around town, quiet, gentle, and living with developmental challenges that made communication difficult. He was compliant, eager to please, and often anxious around authority figures. When officers questioned him, they did so with urgency. Hours passed behind closed doors. And at the end of that interrogation, something happened that changed the course of the investigation. Johnny confessed. He told police he had been involved in the crime. He repeated back phrases that seemed to match what officers believed. On paper, the confession looked complete. And just like that, the case appeared solved. But something was wrong. From the outside, a confession can look final, like the conclusion of a puzzle. But from the moment Johnny spoke the words, something felt off to those who listened closely. His confession lacked detail, the kind of detail real perpetrators rarely forget. He seemed confused when describing the timeline. He could not explain why the crime happened. His words followed the investigator's suggestions, not his own memory. People who knew Johnny said he did not understand what he was agreeing to. He wanted the questions to stop. He wanted to be approved of. He was overwhelmed and likely afraid. But in that interview room, none of that mattered. The only thing recorded in the official report was the confession. Johnny was charged. He never went to trial. He was sentenced and placed into prison for a crime that evidence could not firmly connect him to, but that his own words now seemed to claim. A confession had closed the case, even if the story didn't make sense. The town moves on, but doubt remains. For the community, the arrest brought temporary reassurance. A suspect was behind bars. The town could breathe again. But beneath that calm surface, questions lingered. How could someone with no history of violence suddenly commit a crime so extreme? Why were there no witnesses linking him directly? Why did the physical evidence not align with the confession? These questions were quietly discussed among some residents, but not loudly. The system had spoken. The file was closed. Johnny, meanwhile, sat in a prison cell, repeating for years that he did not do what he had confessed to, that his words had not been the truth, that he had been overwhelmed and had agreed to something he didn't understand. For years, nobody listened. But the truth has a way of resurfacing, sometimes in unexpected voices. Because somewhere else, another man was preparing to speak, a man whose story would unravel everything. A dimly lit interrogation room, one metal table, a chair, a single tape recorder in the center. No movement. Confessions are powerful. They can close cases. They can decide futures. But not every confession is the truth. And when the truth is missing, justice waits in the dark. Years passed. Johnny remained in prison, his confession sitting in the case file as the unquestioned anchor of the verdict. The case was considered closed. The town had moved on, but the truth had not. And truth, even when buried, has a way of returning to the surface. In the early 1990s, another investigation into unrelated crimes led detectives to a different man, a man named Chris Brownfield. Not the singer, a different individual entirely. He was already serving time, already facing the remainder of his life behind bars. During questioning, officers brought up unsolved cases across Missouri, hoping that Brownfield might provide insight into them. Brownfield confessed, not vaguely, not hesitantly, but in clear detail, to the very crime for which Johnny had been convicted. A second confession, with the details Johnny never had. Brownfield's confession was different from Johnny's in every way. He described the house layout without being prompted. He explained the sequence of events without hesitation. He gave a motive, one rooted in personal anger and theft. His timeline aligned with travel records and witness placements. His account matched physical evidence that prosecutors had never been able to link to Johnny. There was no stumbling in his answers, no coached language, no confusion. This was a confession that felt real, not constructed. But the revelation alone did not free Johnny. Because in the legal system, overturning a conviction is far more difficult than creating one. A confession may close a case, but undoing a confession, even a false one, is an uphill climb. The advocate who refused to look away. The turning point came from someone outside law enforcement, Missouri Governor Mel Carnahan. He reviewed the case closely, examining the original interrogation, Johnny's cognitive limitations, the lack of physical evidence, Brownfield's later confession. What he saw was not just a flawed conviction, it was a conviction built on the wrong foundation. Johnny had confessed, but not because he was guilty. He confessed because he did not understand his own situation and because adults in the room shaped the narrative for him. Governor Carnahan took the rare step of formally granting a full pardon in 1995. After 9 years behind bars, Johnny walked out of prison, quietly, without cameras, without celebration, carrying a truth that had waited for nearly a decade to be recognized. The town reconsiders. Aurora did not react loudly. Some people were shocked. Others were confused. And some were silent, unsure how to reconcile what had happened. If a confession can be wrong, how many others like it exist? For investigators, lawyers, judges, and families, the case became a reference point. A case used in training, research, and legal reform. It contributed to a national shift toward recording interrogations, reviewing confessions for reliability, understanding how pressure and suggestibility affect vulnerable individuals. This was no longer just Johnny's story. It became a warning, one written into the system itself. A quiet prison gate opening. No celebration, no crowds. Just a man walking out alone, carrying a small box of belongings. A confession can sound like the truth, but truth does not depend on who speaks first. Truth survives time, challenge, and silence. And sometimes the real story arrives late, but arrives all the same. When Johnny stepped outside the prison gates in 1995, the world looked familiar but different. The town, the roads, the faces, they were the same, but time had kept moving without him. 9 years had passed. Seasons had changed. People had grown older. And Johnny, who had gone in as a young man, returned quieter, more withdrawn, shaped by years spent living a life that was never meant to be his. There was no press conference, no formal announcement, no dramatic reunion scene. Johnny walked out the same way he had walked into the interrogation room years earlier, quietly, with uncertainty, and without fully understanding why things had unfolded the way they did. But this time he was walking toward freedom, and toward the chance to simply live his life again. The family of Pauline Martz also received closure, but not the closure they had expected. Justice did not arrive when Johnny was convicted. It arrived only when the truth was acknowledged. Aurora was left with a difficult truth. The case had been solved once, but incorrectly. The system they trusted had failed someone. People in the community reacted in different ways. Some expressed remorse and sympathy. Others avoided the topic altogether, unwilling or uncomfortable to confront the idea that an innocent man had been imprisoned in their own backyard. There were no villains to point to directly, no singular moment of breakdown. Instead, the case showed how assumptions, urgency, and pressure can shape outcomes, even when everyone believes they are doing the right thing. The case became something larger than the town. It became an example taught in universities, law courses, police academies, and wrongful conviction studies across the United States. A legacy that changed the system. The case helped drive several changes in U.S. investigative practice. Interrogations began to be recorded, not just transcribed. Greater awareness developed about false confessions, especially from vulnerable individuals. Defense attorneys and investigators became more careful in how confessions were evaluated. Courts began recognizing that a confession alone is not proof. Johnny's case was discussed alongside similar wrongful convictions and helped shift legal culture toward more cautious, evidence-based prosecution. In the end, the case did not only correct one injustice, it helped prevent many others. What justice means now. Johnny lived the rest of his life quietly, away from cameras, away from courtrooms, away from the story that defined him for so long. He did not try to reclaim years. He did not demand apologies. He simply lived, which for him was enough. For those who learned his story, the message remained. Justice isn't only about punishment. It is about truth, even when it arrives late, even when it asks us to admit we were wrong. A slow shot of a quiet Missouri sunrise. Golden light spreading over empty fields. No music, just morning wind. A simple front porch. A pair of worn boots beside the door. A quiet life continuing. A confession is not always the truth. And time does not erase what is real. In the end, justice came. Not when the system closed the case, but when it opened its eyes.